You are going to die. This is not dramatic. This is physics. The second law of thermodynamics guarantees it. The biological structures that maintain your body will eventually fail. The coordinated activity of 86 billion nerve cells connected by 100 trillion synapses, consuming 20% of your metabolic energy, producing the electrochemical symphony that somehow generates your thoughts, your memories, your fears, your loves, your sense of being a specific person in a specific body at a specific point in space-time will cease. Your heart will contract for the last time. Your lungs will draw their final breath. The electrical activity in your brain will flatten to a line on the EEG. And then what? Every materialist in the world has the same answer. Nothing. You are your brain. When the brain dies, you die. Consciousness is what neurons do. When neurons stop doing it, consciousness stops. There is no soul. There is no afterlife. There is no continuation. You are a biological machine, and when the machine breaks, the software does not float away to another machine. It simply ceases. That is the materialist answer. It is clean. It is simple. It is logically consistent. And approximately 5 billion people on this planet do not believe it. This is not a religious question. This is not a philosophical question. This is the question. The question that every human being who has ever lived has asked. The question that built the pyramids of Giza as houses for the eternal journey of the Pharaoh's car. The question that produced the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Bardo Thodol and the Aztec Mictlan mythology. The question that launched the AWARE study at the University of Southampton and motivated Roger Penrose to spend 30 years developing a quantum theory of consciousness and drove Ian Stevenson to investigate 2,500 cases of children who claimed to remember previous lives. Every civilization, every century, every continent, every human being, lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling with the sudden vertigo of mortality. The same question: what happens when I die? And across the world, for at least 4,000 years, the most common answer has been this: you come back. Reincarnation, transmigration, rebirth, metempsychosis, the idea that consciousness does not end at death but transfers, moves, continues, in a different body, in a different life, in a different form. The details vary across traditions. The structure is remarkably consistent. Something survives, something transfers, something continues the journey. Approximately 1.5 billion Hindus believe in reincarnation. Approximately 500 million Buddhists believe in rebirth. Approximately 15 million Jains believe in transmigration. Significant populations within Judaism, particularly the Kabbalistic tradition, believe in Gilgul, the cycling of souls. Certain Sufi lineages within Islam describe the soul's journey through multiple forms. The Druze community, approximately 2 million people, hold reincarnation as a core doctrine. The Cathars in medieval Europe believed in it. The Pythagoreans in ancient Greece believed in it. Plato argued for it in the Phaedo and the Republic. Survey data consistently shows that between 20 and 30% of people in Western secular countries report believing in some form of reincarnation, despite having no cultural tradition that teaches it. Across all traditions combined, roughly 1/3 of all humans alive today believe that consciousness survives death and returns in a new form. 1/3 of humanity. This is not a fringe belief. This is one of the most widespread ideas in human history. And the question this series asks is whether modern physics has anything to say about it. Not whether physics proves reincarnation, not whether physics disproves it, whether the actual confirmed measured physics of the 21st century is relevant to the question of whether consciousness can survive the death of the brain and persist in some form. The answer, as you will see, is far more interesting than either side expects. Let me start with what the traditions actually claim, because most people, even most believers, have a simplified cartoon version of reincarnation that does not match what the traditions actually teach. And the details matter, because the details are where the physics becomes relevant. Hinduism, the oldest and most elaborate reincarnation framework. The concept is samsara, the cycle of birth, death and rebirth that every soul Atman undergoes until liberation moksha is achieved. The Rig Veda, the oldest religious text in continuous use, dating to approximately 1500 BCE, contains hymns that hint at rebirth. But the doctrine is fully articulated in the Upanishads, particularly the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and the Chandogya Upanishad, composed between 800 and 500 BCE. The Katha Upanishad contains the famous dialogue between the boy Nachiketa and Yama, the god of death, in which Yama reveals the nature of the Atman and its journey through death and rebirth. The Atman is not the personality, not the memories, not the ego, not the body, not the mind. The Atman is pure consciousness, the witness behind the thoughts, the awareness that observes experience without being changed by it. The Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 22, says, "As a person puts on new garments, giving up old ones, the soul similarly accepts new material bodies, giving up the old and useless ones." Verse 23 continues with extraordinary precision. "Weapons cannot cut it, fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, wind cannot dry it. The Atman is eternal, unborn, undying. It does not come into being when the body is born. It does not perish when the body dies. It was never born and will never die. It is ancient primeval and is not killed when the body is killed. It passes from body to body, the way a person moves from room to room. The rooms change. The person does not." The Hindu framework describes three bodies that the Atman inhabits simultaneously. The Sthula Sharira, the gross physical body, made of the five elements, earth, water, fire, air, space, that you can see and touch. The Sukshma Sharira, the subtle body, made of mind, intellect, ego, and the five subtle senses that carries the impressions of karma from life to life. And the Karana Sharira, the causal body, the seed form that contains the deepest tendencies accumulated across all lifetimes. At death, the gross body disintegrates. The subtle body carrying all karmic impressions detaches and travels to the next birth. The causal body persists until final liberation. This three-body model is relevant to the physics because it suggests that what survives death is not the physical body or its energy, but an informational structure, a pattern of impressions accumulated through experience. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is structurally similar to the concept of quantum information, not the energy of the system. The information encoded in the system, the pattern, the structure, the arrangement. What determines the next body is karma, not fate, not divine punishment. Karma literally means action. Every action leaves an impression, a samskara, on the subtle body. These impressions accumulate across lifetimes, forming tendencies, vasanas, that shape the conditions of the next birth. A life lived in generosity creates impressions that draw the soul towards circumstances of abundance. A life lived in cruelty creates impressions that draw the soul towards circumstances of suffering, not as external judgment, as natural consequence. The way planting wheat produces wheat. Karma is not cosmic justice imposed from outside. Karma is the causal structure of consciousness. Every action has a consequence. Every consequence shapes the next condition. The cycle continues until the Atman recognizes its true nature as identical with Brahman, the universal consciousness. Then liberation moksha. The cycle ends, not through death, through knowledge jnana. through the direct experiential realization that the individual consciousness was never separate from the universal consciousness. That separation was Maya illusion, that the rooms were always one house, that the wave was always the ocean. Buddhism. The Buddhist framework is more subtle and more radical than any other tradition's approach to rebirth. The Buddha explicitly denied the existence of a permanent self. The doctrine of anatta, no self, says there is no Atman, no eternal unchanging soul that transmigrates from body to body, no fixed essence that persists through the cycle. This is the Buddha's most revolutionary teaching and the one that distinguishes Buddhist rebirth from Hindu reincarnation at the deepest level. What continues is not a thing, but a process. The consciousness stream Vijnana Santana, a continuous flow of mental events, each causing the next, the way one candle flame lights another candle. The first flame touches the wick of the second candle. The second candle burns. Is the flame the same flame? No. The first flame is on the first candle, the second on the second. Is it a different flame? No. It was caused by the first. It is a continuation, a causal sequence without identity but also without discontinuity, a process without a substance. This is a critical distinction that most people miss entirely, and it has profound implications for the physics. Hindu reincarnation says a thing, the Atman moves from body to body, like a passenger moving between vehicles. Buddhist rebirth says a process, the consciousness stream continues from life to life, without anything that moves. There is continuation without a continua, causation without a substance that is caused, process without a processor. The difference is philosophically enormous. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition developed the most detailed map of the dying process in any world religion. The Bardo Thodol, commonly translated as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes 3 bardos, 3 intermediate states between death and rebirth. The Chikai Bardo, the moment of death, when the clear light of reality dawns and the experienced practitioner can recognize it and achieve liberation. The Chonyid Bardo, where visions arise from the deepest patterns of consciousness and the deceased, encounters what Jungian psychology would call archetypal forms. And the Sidpa Bardo, the bardo of becoming, where the consciousness stream, driven by karmic momentum, is drawn toward rebirth and enters the womb of the next mother. The entire process is described with clinical precision. The dissolution of the elements, the cessation of breath, the inner dissolution of consciousness into subtler and subtler states, the dawning of the ground luminosity, the arising of the bardo visions, the attraction to the next birth. This is not vague mysticism. This is a phenomenological manual, a detailed first-person account of what the dying process looks like from the inside, compiled over centuries by practitioners who spent their entire lives preparing for and investigating death through meditation. And as we will see in Part 3, the Buddhist version of rebirth maps more closely onto quantum mechanics than any other tradition's framework, because quantum mechanics also describes reality as processes, not things, as events, not objects, as verbs, not nouns. The electron is not a thing that moves through space. The electron is a temporary excitation of the electron field, a process, a pattern, a continuation without a substance. The wave function propagates, the excitation continues, but nothing moves. Anatta, in the language of quantum field theory. The mechanism of Buddhist rebirth is pratitya samutpada, dependent origination. The 12 links of dependent origination describe how one life gives rise to the next through a chain of causation. Ignorance leads to volitional formations. Formations lead to consciousness. Consciousness leads to name and form. And so on through the 12 links, ending in aging and death, which condition the ignorance that begins the next cycle. No soul transmigrates, no substance transfers, but the causal chain continues. The pattern persists, the process propagates, the way a wave propagates through water. No water molecule travels from one end of the ocean to the other, but the wave does. The wave is real. The wave carries energy and information, but the wave is not a thing. It is a pattern in a medium. Jainism. The Jain framework is perhaps the most systematic and in some ways the most scientifically structured of all the reincarnation traditions. Mahavira, the 24th Tirthankara, and contemporary of the Buddha, taught that every living being, from the largest whale to the smallest microorganism, has a jiva, a soul that is intrinsically pure, omniscient, and blissful. The jiva in its natural state possesses infinite knowledge, infinite perception, infinite bliss, and infinite energy. But across beginningless time, the jiva has accumulated karma, and karma in Jainism is understood not as abstract moral consequence, but as actual physical particles, extremely fine matter that adheres to the soul the way dust adheres to a wet surface. These karmic particles obscure the jiva's natural properties the way dust on a mirror obscures its reflective surface. The jiva does not need to acquire knowledge. It needs to remove the karmic matter that blocks the knowledge it already has. The soul transmigrates through 4 gatis categories of existence. Deva, celestial beings with great power and pleasure. Manusha, humans with the unique capacity for liberation. Tiryancha, animals, plants, and microorganisms, and Naraki hell beings who suffer until their karmic debt is exhausted. The specific birth is determined entirely by the type and quantity of karmic particles accumulated. 8 types of karma are described in extraordinary taxonomic detail in the Jain texts. Knowledge obscuring karma, perception obscuring karma, feeling producing karma, deluding karma, lifespan determining karma, body determining karma, status determining karma, obstructing karma. Each type has subtypes. The system is as detailed as a periodic table of moral consequence. The cycle continues until all karmic particles are removed through the 3 jewels. Right faith samyak darshana, right knowledge samyak jnana, right conduct samyak charitra. When the last karmic particle is shed, the jiva achieves kevala jnana, infinite knowledge and omniscience. At the death of that final body, the jiva achieves moksha, rising to Siddhashila, the summit of the universe, where it exists forever in its pure state, free, omniscient, infinite. The Jain conception of karma as physical substance is unique among the world's traditions and has an unexpected structural parallel in modern physics. The idea that something physical accumulates around consciousness through interactions and changes its properties and trajectory is structurally similar to decoherence in quantum mechanics. Decoherence occurs when a quantum system interacts with its environment, becoming entangled with surrounding particles. The system's quantum information becomes spread across these interactions. Its pure quantum properties become obscured. Its behavior becomes classical. The more interactions, the more decoherence. The more decoherence, the more the system behaves like ordinary matter rather than exhibiting quantum properties. Replace jiva with quantum system. Replace karmic particles with environmental entanglement. Replace obscured omniscience with decohered quantum information. The structure maps, not perfectly, not literally, but specifically enough to warrant serious attention. Now, the Abrahamic traditions, and here the picture is different, fundamentally different. Islam. Orthodox Islamic theology does not teach reincarnation. The Quran is explicit. Every soul tastes death. You shall be paid in full your wages on the day of resurrection. Quran 3-185. The soul nafs lives once in the material world. At death, it enters the barzakh, an intermediate realm between death and resurrection. On the day of judgment, Yawm al-Qiyamah, every soul is resurrected, given a new body, and judged according to its deeds. The righteous enter Jannah, paradise. The unrighteous face Jahannam. There is no return to the material world, no second body, no cycle, one life, one death, one judgment. This is the orthodox position shared by all four Sunni schools of jurisprudence and the 12 Shia tradition. But there are exceptions. The Druze, a community that emerged from Ismaili Islam in the 11th century, teach reincarnation as a core doctrine. The soul transmigrates immediately at death into a new body. Always human to human, no animal incarnations, no intermediate realm. The Druze say they can sometimes remember previous lives, and the community has documented numerous cases of children describing past life memories that were verified by the families of the deceased individuals. Some Sufi traditions, particularly those influenced by Ibn Arabi's concept of the barzakh, describe the soul's journey in terms that resemble transmigration, without using the word. The soul passes through stations, maqamat, and states, ahwal, that can be understood as different modes of existence, not necessarily confined to a single biological lifetime. The Quran itself contains verses that some scholars interpret as suggesting pre-existence of souls. Quran 7-172 describes God addressing all human souls before their birth, asking, "Am I not your Lord?" and all souls answering, "Yes, we testify." If souls existed before birth, the question of whether they exist after death and possibly before another birth becomes more complex than the simple one-life model suggests. Christianity. The orthodox position mirrors Islam. One life, one death, judgment, heaven or hell. The Nicene Creed affirms the resurrection of the body, not the transmigration of the soul. The Council of Constantinople in 553 CE formally condemned the teaching of the pre-existence of souls, which was associated with Origen, one of the early church fathers who had argued that souls existed before their incarnation and might undergo multiple embodiments as part of God's redemptive plan. But early Christianity was more diverse on this question than modern Christianity acknowledges. The Gnostic Christians, particularly the Valentinians and the Scythians, taught forms of reincarnation, and the New Testament itself contains a curious passage. In Matthew 17:12, 1-3, Jesus says of John the Baptist that Elijah has already come and they did not recognize him. The disciples understood that he was speaking of John the Baptist. The implication that John the Baptist was Elijah returned is textually present, whether or not it was intended as a teaching on reincarnation. Judaism. The mainstream position in Rabbinic Judaism does not emphasize reincarnation, but the Kabbalistic tradition, which became enormously influential after the 13th century, teaches Gilgul Neshamot, the cycling of souls, explicitly. The Zohar, the central text of Kabbalah, describes souls returning to the physical world to complete unfinished spiritual work, to rectify sins from previous incarnations, or to assist other souls. Isaac Luria, the great 16th century Kabbalist in Deathbed, developed an elaborate system of Gilgul that describes how soul sparks nitzotzot can fragment and recombine across lifetimes. In Hasidic Judaism, which descends from Kabbalistic mysticism, belief in Gilgul is common. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, taught it. Stories of remembered past lives appear throughout Hasidic literature. Now, here is the observation that sets up the entire physics investigation of this series. Every tradition, whether it affirms reincarnation or denies it, whether it is Eastern or Western, ancient or modern, mystical or institutional, agrees on one foundational claim. Something about consciousness is not reducible to the physical body. The Hindu says the Atman is eternal and passes from body to body like a person changing clothes. The Buddhist says the consciousness stream continues from life to life like a flame passed between candles. The Muslim says the nafs survives death and enters the barzakh to await resurrection. The Christian says the soul is created by God at conception and is immortal, surviving the death of the body forever. The Jain says the jiva has existed since beginningless time and will exist until liberation. The Kabbalist says the neshama cycles through incarnations until its spiritual work is complete. They disagree violently about what happens next: reincarnation or resurrection, cycle or judgment, return or finality, dissolution into Brahman or eternal individuality in heaven, rebirth as an animal or exclusively human incarnation, liberation through knowledge or salvation through grace or awakening through meditation. The disagreements are real and irreconcilable, but beneath every disagreement lies one shared assumption, one axiom that every tradition builds upon. Consciousness is not identical with the body. When the body dies, consciousness does not simply cease. There is something about awareness, about the inner light of subjective experience, about the fact that it feels like something to be you, rather than being nothing at all. That something is not destroyed when the neurons stop firing. Not in any tradition, not in any culture, not in any century, not one. 5 billion people alive today hold some version of this belief, and the question is whether they are all wrong. Whether the materialist position that consciousness equals brain activity and death equals termination is the only scientifically defensible position, or whether the physics of the 21st century has opened doors that the materialism of the 19th century assumed were permanently closed. Before we open those doors, I need to close a fake one. Because there is a bad physics argument for the survival of consciousness that is so widespread, so popular, so endlessly repeated in spiritual communities and on social media that it has become the default scientific-sounding defense of reincarnation. And it is wrong, completely wrong, and using it damages the credibility of the entire investigation. The argument is about energy, and I need to demolish it before we can build anything real in its place. And here is where most people make the physics mistake. The mistake that is repeated in thousands of YouTube videos and Instagram posts and late-night conversations. The most common argument you hear is this: energy cannot be created or destroyed, the first law of thermodynamics. Therefore, the energy of consciousness must go somewhere when you die. Therefore, reincarnation, or survival, or something. You have heard this argument. You might have made this argument. It sounds scientific. It invokes a real law of physics. It feels rigorous. It is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. And I need to explain why carefully and precisely before we go any further. Because building a case on bad physics is worse than building no case at all. An intellectual honesty, the same intellectual honesty that defines this channel, requires demolishing bad arguments even when they support conclusions you might agree with, especially when they support conclusions you might agree with. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy is conserved in a closed system. The total energy of an isolated system does not change over time. It transforms from one form to another. Kinetic energy becomes thermal energy when a ball hits a wall. Chemical energy becomes electrical energy in a battery. Nuclear energy becomes radiant energy in the sunday. Mass itself is a form of energy, as Einstein showed with E equals mc squared. The total across all forms is constant. Energy is never created from nothing. Energy is never destroyed into nothing. This is correct. This is confirmed by every experiment ever performed. This is one of the most well-established laws in all of physics. But here is what the argument gets catastrophically wrong. The energy in your body is not the energy of your consciousness. Or more precisely, there is no evidence that consciousness is a form of energy in the thermodynamic sense. The energy in your body is thermal energy approximately 37 degrees Celsius worth. Chemical energy stored in approximately 7 times 10 to the 18 joules worth of ATP molecules and glucose and fatty acids and protein bonds. Electrochemical energy in the ion gradients across your neural membranes. Sodium and potassium ions pumped against their concentration gradients, storing potential energy, like water behind a dam. When you die, this energy does not disappear. The first law guarantees that. But where does it go? Into heat, into the environment. Your body temperature drops to ambient, into chemistry. The bacteria that decompose your tissues, metabolize your chemical stores, into the soil, into the atmosphere. The atoms that were you become the atoms of something else. The carbon in your muscles becomes carbon in the earth. The nitrogen in your DNA becomes nitrogen in the air. The first law is satisfied perfectly. Every joule accounted for. Energy is conserved. It goes into heat and chemistry and decomposition, and the slow recycling of matter through the biosphere. Not into a soul, not into a next life, not into a consciousness that floats away to inhabit another body, into heat. The thermodynamic argument for reincarnation confuses the energy of metabolism with the energy of consciousness, and there is no equation in thermodynamics that describes consciousness as a form of energy. There is no unit of consciousness in the international system of units. There is no consciousness term in any thermodynamic equation. The first law of thermodynamics is about thermal systems, not about awareness. Using it to argue for the survival of consciousness is like using Ohm's law to argue for the existence of love. The law is real. The application is a category error. This matters because bad arguments discredit good questions. And this is a good question. The question of whether consciousness survives death is a legitimate question. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics, which shows that consciousness might be fundamental to the operation of physical reality, makes it a legitimate physics question. The hard problem of consciousness, which shows that subjective experience cannot be reduced to neural activity, makes it a legitimate neuroscience question. The 4,000 years of contemplative reports from every culture on Earth make it a legitimate experiential question. Ian Stevenson's 2,500 documented cases of children reporting past life memories make it a legitimate empirical question. But the thermodynamic argument energy cannot be destroyed, therefore the soul survives is not a legitimate physics argument. It is a misunderstanding of what energy means in physics. And every time someone makes this argument on social media, they give materialist critics an easy target and make the serious scientific investigation of consciousness look foolish by association. So if the thermodynamic argument fails, what does physics actually say about the survival of consciousness? Is there a legitimate physics framework that addresses the question honestly and rigorously? Yes, there is. And it is not thermodynamics. It is quantum mechanics, specifically quantum information theory. The concept is not energy conservation. The concept is information conservation. Unitarity. The mathematical property of the Schrödinger equation that guarantees quantum information is never destroyed. Never. Under any physical transformation, including death. And this is a fundamentally different and far more powerful argument than the thermodynamic one. Because information is not heat. Information is not chemical energy. Information is not measured in joules or calories or kilowatt hours. Information is the pattern, the structure, the organization, the specific arrangement that makes you you rather than someone else. The specific configuration of memories and personality and consciousness that constitutes your identity. And if consciousness is information rather than energy, then the conservation law that matters is not the first law of thermodynamics. It is unitarity, the conservation of quantum information. And unitarity does not say your heat is conserved when you die. Unitarity says your pattern is conserved, your information, your structure, the thing that makes you you. But that is part 3. We need to build the case carefully. First, in part 2, we examine the evidence. Not the physics, not the philosophy, the evidence. The specific documented cases that have been investigated by scientists using scientific methodology published in peer-reviewed journals and debated in the academic literature for decades. Children who describe previous lives with specific, verifiable details. Near-death experiences reported by patients who were clinically dead, with flat EEGs and no measurable brain activity. Terminal lucidity in Alzheimer's patients whose brains are physically destroyed by plaques and tangles, but who recover full consciousness and clear memory minutes before death. Deathbed visions reported by hospice nurses and documented by end-of-life researchers across cultures. Each of these phenomena has been documented, studied, published, and each resists easy explanation within the standard materialist framework that says consciousness is what the brain does, and when the brain stops doing it, consciousness ends. The evidence will not prove reincarnation. I tell you that now so you are not disappointed later, but the evidence will show you that the question is not settled, that there are cracks in the materialist framework, specific, measured, documented cracks. And what lies on the other side of those cracks is the most important question in science, or in religion, or in both. Consider what we have established so far. Energy conservation does not save you. Quantum information conservation might, but only if consciousness is information. And the question of whether consciousness is information is currently the most important unsolved question at the intersection of physics and philosophy. Now let me add one more layer of physics that connects directly to the reincarnation question: quantum entanglement. The phenomenon we discussed in the Science versus Religion series. Two particles that interact become entangled. Their quantum states remain correlated regardless of distance. What happens to one instantaneously affects the other. Nobel Prize, 2022. Confirmed. Real. Here is the relevance to reincarnation. If consciousness involves quantum processes in the brain, as Penrose Hameroff propose, then those quantum processes are entangled with the environment. With every photon that enters your eyes, with every air molecule that touches your skin, with every person you interact with, your quantum state is not isolated, it is entangled with the world. And entanglement is not destroyed by the death of one subsystem. When one particle in an entangled pair is destroyed, the entanglement persists in the remaining correlations with the environment. The quantum information is not lost. It is redistributed, delocalized, spread across the network of entanglements that your consciousness participated in during life. This is speculative. I want to be clear. This is not confirmed physics applied to consciousness. This is confirmed physics of entanglement combined with an unconfirmed hypothesis about quantum consciousness. The speculation is whether the entanglement network could serve as a carrier for consciousness patterns after the death of the brain. Whether the distributed correlations could reassemble under certain conditions into a new, coherent, conscious state. Whether quantum mechanics provides a mechanism for what the traditions call reincarnation. The honest answer is we do not know. The physics of entanglement is confirmed. The application to consciousness is speculative. The mechanism of reassembly is unknown. But the structural possibility exists within the framework of quantum mechanics. And the structural possibility is more than anyone expected 50 years ago. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition describes the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. The Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes the consciousness of the dying person passing through stages of dissolution. The earth element dissolves, then water, then fire, then air, then consciousness itself enters the clear light, the ground, luminosity. If the person recognizes the clear light, they achieve liberation. If not, the consciousness is carried by karmic winds into a new birth. The process takes up to 49 days according to the tradition. The process described in the Bardo Thodol is structurally similar to quantum decoherence. The organized quantum state of consciousness dissolves progressively. Each stage represents the loss of a layer of coherent quantum information. Earth element equals the loss of solid-state quantum coherence. Water equals loss of fluid-state coherence. Fire equals loss of thermal coherence. Air equals loss of kinetic coherence. And the clear light equals the fundamental ground state of quantum information stripped of all specific content but retaining the capacity for consciousness itself. Am I claiming the Tibetan Buddhists described quantum decoherence 12 centuries before physics discovered it? No. I am claiming that the phenomenological description of dying in the Bardo Thodol and the physical description of quantum decoherence share a structural similarity that is specific enough to demand attention. Both describe a progressive dissolution from organized to fundamental. Both describe stages. Both describe a ground state that persists after all specific content is lost. Both describe the possibility of reorganization from the ground state into a new specific state. The parallel might be coincidental. The parallel might be convergent. Two methods of investigating the same process from different angles. We investigate this question with full rigor in Part 3, where we examine the quantum mechanics in mathematical detail. For now, I want to leave you with one observation and one question. The observation: every conservation law in physics was initially controversial. Energy conservation was debated for decades before being accepted. Momentum conservation seemed to violate common sense until Newton formalized it. Charge conservation was not established until Faraday's experiments. And information conservation was debated for 30 years until Hawking conceded. Conservation laws are how physics tracks what is fundamental, what cannot be destroyed, what persists through every transformation. Energy, momentum, charge, angular momentum, and now information. If consciousness is information, then consciousness joins the list of fundamentally conserved quantities, not because of philosophy, not because of religion, because of physics. The question: if the most fundamental law of the most successful theory in physics says that information is never destroyed, and if consciousness is information, then where does your consciousness go when you die? Not your energy, not your atoms, your consciousness, your pattern, your information, the specific configuration that makes you you. Where does it go? Physics says it goes somewhere. Physics says it is conserved. Physics does not yet say where or in what form or whether it ever reconstitutes into something recognizable. But physics says it is not destroyed, and that single fact changes the entire conversation about death. In Part 1, we examined what the traditions claim. 6 major traditions, 4 that affirm reincarnation, 2 that deny it. All 6 agreeing that consciousness is not reducible to the body. We demolished the thermodynamic argument for the survival of consciousness and identified quantum information theory as the legitimate physics framework. Now we examine the evidence, not the beliefs, not the philosophy, not the physics yet, the evidence. The specific documented cases that have been investigated by scientists using scientific methodology published in peer-reviewed journals and debated in the academic literature for decades. I want to be precise about what I mean by evidence. I do not mean anecdotes. I do not mean stories. Someone told someone who posted it on Reddit. I mean systematic empirical research conducted by credentialed scientists at major universities using protocols designed to minimize bias, published in journals with editorial review and peer review, and available for anyone to scrutinize, criticize, and attempt to replicate. The standards I apply in this video are the same standards I would apply to any claim in physics or neuroscience or medicine. If the evidence does not meet those standards, I will say so. If it does meet those standards, I will say that too, regardless of what the evidence implies. Let us begin with the most remarkable body of evidence in the entire field: children who remember previous lives. In 1960, Ian Stevenson was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia. He was not a mystic. He was not a believer in reincarnation. He was a mainstream academic psychiatrist with a medical degree from McGill and faculty appointments at 3 universities. He published in the standard psychiatric journals. His colleagues respected him. His career was secure. Then he began investigating children who claimed to remember previous lives, and he spent the next 40 years of his career doing almost nothing else. Stevenson's methodology was rigorous. When he heard of a case, typically a child between the ages of 2 and 5, who was making specific claims about a previous life, he would travel to the location, often in India, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Turkey, or Myanmar, and interview the child's family. And if the claimed previous person could be identified, the previous person's family. He would document the child's statements before any contact between the 2 families had occurred whenever possible. He would verify the specific claims against the facts of the deceased person's life. He would look for normal explanations. Had the families had prior contact? Had the child been exposed to information about the deceased person through media or conversation? Was the child's family motivated to fabricate the story for social or financial reasons? He would document birthmarks and birth defects on the child that corresponded to wounds on the deceased person, particularly wounds that caused death. Over 40 years, Stevenson investigated approximately 2,500 cases. He published his findings in multiple books and in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and contributions to mainstream psychiatric literature. His 2-volume magnum opus, Reincarnation and Biology, a contribution to the etiology of birthmarks and birth defects, published in 1997, runs to 2,268 pages and documents 225 cases in which children had birthmarks or birth defects that corresponded to wounds, usually fatal wounds, on the identified previous person. In many cases, Stevenson obtained autopsy reports or medical records of the deceased person and photographed the child's birthmarks, showing the correspondence with clinical precision. The birthmark cases are particularly significant because they resist the standard psychological explanations. A child might fabricate memories or absorb information unconsciously through cryptomnesia, but a child cannot fabricate a birthmark. Birthmarks are present at birth. They are physical. They are visible. They are documented by physicians. And when a birthmark on a child corresponds in location, size, and shape to a wound documented in an autopsy report of a person the child claims to have been, the correspondence requires explanation. Let me describe 2 specific cases so you understand the level of detail involved. The case of Chanai Chumalaiwong, a boy born in central Thailand in 1967. At the age of 3, Chanai began telling his family that he had been a school teacher named Buakai Lornak who had been shot and killed while riding his bicycle to school. Chanai provided specific details: the name of the school, the name of the village, the names of his parents in the previous life, the names of his wife and children, the manner of his death, shot from behind while cycling. He asked repeatedly to be taken to the village where Buakai had lived. When Stevenson investigated, he found that Buakai Lornak had existed, had been a school teacher in the village Chanai named, had been shot and killed while riding his bicycle exactly as Chanai described. The names Chanai gave for the wife, parents, and children were correct. The 2 families had no prior contact. They lived in different provinces, separated by considerable distance. There was no television in the rural area where Chanai lived. No newspaper coverage of the murder that the family recalled seeing. No obvious way for a 3-year-old boy to have obtained this specific information through any normal channel, and there were birthmarks. Chanai had 2 birthmarks, a small round birthmark on the back of his head and a larger irregular birthmark on his forehead above his left eye. Bua Kai had been shot in the back of the head. The bullet had entered at the back, creating a small round entry wound, and exited through the front of the skull above the left eye, creating a larger, irregular exit wound. The entry wound corresponded precisely to Chanai's small round birthmark. The exit wound corresponded precisely to Chanai's larger irregular birthmark. Stevenson obtained the autopsy report and photographed both the report and the birthmarks. The correspondence in size, location, and shape was documented clinically. The case of Süleyman Çağlar, a Turkish boy who at the age of 2 began describing a previous life as a farmer named Mehmet who had been beaten to death. The boy described the village, the family, the circumstances of the murder. Investigation confirmed that a man matching the description had been killed in the village named. The boy had a large birthmark on the right side of his head. The deceased man had suffered fatal blows to the right side of his head. The correspondence was confirmed through police records. These are 2 cases out of 2,500. Not all cases are this strong. Many have weaknesses. In some cases, the families had prior contact. In some cases, the child's statements were not documented before verification. In some cases, the match between the child's claims and the deceased person's life was partial, not complete. Stevenson himself was scrupulously honest about the limitations of individual cases. But the cumulative weight of 2,500 cases, many with verified specific details, and some with corresponding birthmarks, is not something that can be dismissed with a wave of the hand. After Stevenson's death in 2007, his work was continued by Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia. Tucker has focused particularly on American cases, which are important because they occur in a culture that does not traditionally teach reincarnation, reducing the possibility that the children's claims are culturally conditioned. Tucker's book Return to Life, published in 2013, documents several American cases. The case of James Leininger is Tucker's most famous. James was born in 1998 inches, Louisiana. From the age of 2, he had vivid nightmares about being shot down in an airplane. He would scream, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." When awake, he provided specific details. He said he flew a Corsair. He said he took off from a ship called the Natoma. He said his name had been James. He said he had been shot down by the Japanese. He said his friend's name was Jack Larson. His parents were evangelical Christians who did not believe in reincarnation. His father actively tried to debunk his son's claims. He researched military records. He found that the escort carrier USS Natoma Bay had operated in the Pacific during World War II, that a pilot named James Huston Jr. he had been killed in action on the 3rd of March 1945, when his FM-2 Wildcat, not a Corsair, but a similar single-engine fighter, was hit by anti-aircraft fire during the Battle of Iwo Jima. That another pilot on the Natoma Bay was named Jack Larson. That Houston's plane had been hit in the engine and crashed into the water. James Leininger had provided the name of the ship, the name of a fellow pilot, the first name of the pilot, and the manner of death. He was 2 years old. His family had no connection to World War II aviation. Tucker investigated the case. He verified the military records. He interviewed the family extensively. He could find no normal explanation for how a 2-year-old in Louisiana could have known the name of an obscure escort carrier, the name of a specific pilot, and the circumstances of a specific combat death in 1945. The materialist response to cases like these typically invokes several explanations. Fraud. The families fabricated the stories, but Stevenson and Tucker specifically looked for fraud. They investigated the families' backgrounds, their motivations, their opportunities for deception. In many cases, the families were reluctant to publicize the cases and gained nothing from them. Cryptomnesia. The children picked up the information from normal sources, television conversations, books overheard, adult discussions, and then forgot the source presenting the information as memories. This is possible in some cases, but it is difficult to explain how a 2-year-old would pick up the name of an obscure World War II escort carrier, or how a 3-year-old in rural Thailand would learn the name of a murdered schoolteacher in a different province. The information in the strongest cases is too specific and too obscure for casual exposure to explain. Confirmation bias. The investigators saw what they wanted to see, remembered the hits and forgot the misses. This is a legitimate methodological concern with any observational research, but Stevenson and Tucker documented both the matches and the misses, published their hit rates, acknowledged the cases that did not pan out. Their methodology was not perfect, but it was far more rigorous than critics typically acknowledge. None of these explanations individually or collectively accounts for all the cases. Some cases can be explained by fraud, some by cryptomnesia, some by confirmation bias, but 2,500 cases from different cultures, different decades, different investigators, with consistent features, specific, verifiable details, and in some cases, corresponding birthmarks, represent a body of evidence that deserves a better response than hand-waving. Now, near-death experiences, NDEs, a completely separate line of evidence that converges on the same question. The study of NDEs begins in modern form with Raymond Moody's 1975 book, Life After Life, which documented common features reported by patients who had been resuscitated after clinical death. But Moody was a philosopher, not a clinician, and his methodology was informal. The serious scientific investigation began with the work of cardiologists and critical care physicians who encountered the phenomenon in their clinical practice and decided to study it systematically. In 2001, Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, published a landmark prospective study in The Lancet, one of the 2 or 3 most prestigious medical journals in the world. The study was designed with the rigor expected of a top-tier medical publication. Van Lommel studied 344 consecutive patients who had been resuscitated after cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals over a 13-year period from 1988 to 2001. The word consecutive is important. He did not select patients who reported experiences. He included every cardiac arrest survivor, regardless of whether they reported anything. This eliminates selection bias. All 344 patients had been clinically dead. No heartbeat, no respiration, no blood pressure, and critically, within seconds of cardiac arrest, no measurable brain activity. The EEG goes flat within 10 to 20 seconds of the heart stopping. This is well-established physiology. The brain depends on continuous blood flow for oxygen and glucose. No blood flow means no oxygen, means no glucose, means no ATP, means no ion gradients, means no electrical activity. The cortex shuts down in seconds. The brainstem follows shortly after. The brain is not functioning. By every measure we have, the brain is off. Of the 344 patients, 62 reported conscious experiences during the period of clinical death. 18%, nearly 1 in 5. And the depth and complexity of these experiences did not correlate with the duration of cardiac arrest or the medications administered, or the patient's age or gender, or prior religious beliefs. Atheists and believers reported the same structures. Patients who had never heard of NDEs described the same features as patients who had read Moody's book. The experiences had remarkably consistent features across patients and across all subsequent studies. A sense of profound peace and well-being, often described as the most peaceful state the person had ever experienced. A perception of separating from the physical body and observing the resuscitation from above, movement, through a dark space or tunnel toward an intensely bright light that did not hurt the eyes, an encounter with deceased relatives who appeared healthy and younger than at the time of their death, an encounter with a being of light variously described as God, Jesus, an angel, or simply a presence of overwhelming love. A panoramic life review in which the person's entire life was reviewed instantaneously and simultaneously, often from the perspective of other people experiencing the emotional impact of their actions on others. A sense of approaching a border or boundary, a river, a fence, a line of light that if crossed would make return impossible. A decision or instruction to return, usually accompanied by a reason, such as unfinished responsibilities or young children. And then resuscitation, return to the body, often accompanied by profound reluctance to leave the experience and return to physical life. Van Lommel followed up with his patients over 8 years. The patients who had NDEs showed lasting personality changes, increased empathy, decreased fear of death, increased interest in spirituality, decreased interest in material possessions. These changes persisted for years after the event. Patients who had cardiac arrests without NDEs did not show the same pattern of personality change. The experience left a permanent mark. In 2014, Sam Parnia at the State University of New York launched the AWARE study, the largest prospective investigation of consciousness during cardiac arrest ever conducted. The study was conducted across 15 hospitals in the United States, the United Kingdom and Austria. 2,060 cardiac arrest patients were included. Of those who survived and could be interviewed, 39% reported some degree of awareness during the period of cardiac arrest. 9% had experiences consistent with a classic NDE. The AWARE study also included an ingenious test. In participating hospitals, shelves were installed near the ceiling of resuscitation rooms. On these shelves, images were placed that could only be seen from above. If patients who reported out-of-body experiences during cardiac arrest were actually perceiving the room from an elevated vantage point, they should be able to describe these images. The results were inconclusive. Only 2 patients reported visual awareness during verified cardiac arrest, and of these, only 1 had the cardiac arrest in a room with the shelf targets. That patient did not report seeing the target image, but the patient did report accurate visual details of the resuscitation that were verified by the medical staff. The patient described specific actions taken by the medical team during a period when the patient had no heartbeat and a flat EEG. How does a brain with no electrical activity produce conscious experience? How does a patient with a flat EEG accurately perceive and later describe specific events in the room? The standard materialist answer is that the experiences occur either before or after the period of flat EEG, that there is a brief window before the brain fully shuts down or after it begins to recover, in which residual neural activity could produce experiences. This is possible. The EEG measures cortical surface activity and might miss deeper subcortical activity. The timing of experiences during cardiac arrest is difficult to establish precisely, but this answer has problems. Van Lommel's study included patients whose NDEs contained veridical perceptions of events that occurred during the period of verified clinical death, events that the patient could not have observed normally because their eyes were closed and they were unconscious, and their brain had no measurable electrical activity. The most famous case in the NDE literature is the case reported by Maria, a migrant worker in Seattle, who during cardiac arrest described a tennis shoe on a third-floor window ledge of the hospital. A social worker later found the shoe exactly where and how Maria described it, on a ledge that was not visible from the ground or from inside the building. Maria could not have seen the shoe at any point before or after her cardiac arrest. Cases like Maria's are rare. They are anecdotal. They are not controlled experiments, and they cannot be easily replicated, but they exist, and they resist easy explanation within any framework that says consciousness is produced exclusively by the brain. Now, terminal lucidity and deathbed visions. Terminal lucidity is less well known than NDEs, but in some ways more scientifically significant for the question of whether consciousness is produced by the brain, because terminal lucidity directly challenges the most basic assumption of the materialist model in a way that NDEs do not. Terminal lucidity is the unexpected return of mental clarity, memory, and personality in patients who have suffered severe and irreversible brain damage. The phenomenon is most commonly documented in patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease. These patients have brains that are physically ravaged. Amyloid plaques accumulate between neurons, blocking synaptic signaling. Neurofibrillary tangles of tau protein form inside neurons, destroying them from within. The hippocampus, the brain structure most critical for memory formation, shrinks by 25% or more. The cortex thins. Total brain volume decreases by 30 to 40%. The physical hardware of memory and personality and identity is destroyed, not metaphorically, physically, visibly on MRI and CT scans. The neurons are dead, the connections are severed, the tissue is gone, and yet, in the hours or sometimes minutes before death, these patients suddenly become lucid. They recognize their family members whom they have not recognized for years. They speak coherently and sometimes eloquently after months or years of incoherent mumbling or complete silence. They recall memories from decades ago, memories that should be physically impossible to recall because the neurons that stored them were destroyed by the disease years earlier. They express love. They reference specific shared experiences. They say goodbye with full awareness of what is happening, and then they die, usually within hours, sometimes within minutes. Michael Nahm, a German biologist, coined the modern term terminal lucidity and has systematically documented cases in the medical literature. Bruce Grayson, at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, has compiled additional cases. Alexander Bastiani at the University of Vienna surveyed over 800 caregivers working with dementia patients and found that approximately 5 to 10% reported witnessing episodes of terminal lucidity. The phenomenon is recognized in hospice and palliative care literature. It is not rare, it is not anecdotal, it is a documented clinical phenomenon that occurs regularly in end-of-life care settings. The significance for the consciousness debate is stark and unavoidable. If consciousness is produced by the brain the way a factory produces goods, then the return of full consciousness from a physically destroyed brain should be impossible. You cannot run software on destroyed hardware. You cannot produce a signal from a broken transmitter. The neurons that stored the memories are dead. The synaptic connections that enabled coherent thought are severed. The cortex that generated personality is atrophied. The brain cannot produce what it does not have the physical capacity to produce, and yet it does. Briefly, at the very end, as if something had been trying to get through all along and finally found a way. This is precisely what the filter theory predicts. William James proposed in his 1898 Ingersoll lecture at Harvard that the brain might not produce consciousness the way a factory produces goods. The brain might transmit consciousness the way a prism transmits light, or more precisely the way a reducing valve restricts flow. The brain filters consciousness, narrows it, focuses it, channels the vast field of awareness into the specific narrow beam needed for biological survival. Damage the filter and the consciousness gets distorted. Because the filter is damaged, the signal is degraded. This explains why brain damage usually reduces consciousness. But at the moment of death, when the filter is breaking down entirely, the restriction might paradoxically lift. The full signal might come through briefly before the receiver fails completely. Terminal lucidity is the moment when the reducing valve opens, the full consciousness floods in, and then the valve breaks, and the consciousness is no longer received by this particular brain. The factory model cannot explain terminal lucidity. The filter model predicts it. This does not prove the filter model is correct. but it is a data point, a significant data point, and it demands explanation from anyone who holds the materialist position. There is also the phenomenon of deathbed visions, reported extensively by hospice workers and end-of-life caregivers. Patients in the final hours or days of life describe seeing deceased relatives, often relatives they did not know were dead. They describe beings of light. They describe landscapes of extraordinary beauty. They become calm. They stop being afraid. They appear to be seeing something that the people around them cannot see, and they describe what they see with specificity and conviction. Peter Fenwick, a British neuropsychiatrist, and Erlendur Haraldsson, an Icelandic psychologist, conducted the most systematic studies of deathbed visions across cultures. Their findings showed consistent features regardless of the patient's cultural background, religious beliefs, or prior expectations. Indian Hindu patients and British secular patients described structurally similar experiences. The consistency across cultures suggests that the phenomenon is not simply cultural expectation manifesting as hallucination. Are deathbed visions hallucinations produced by a dying brain? The neurochemistry of the dying process, including oxygen deprivation, endorphin release, and cortical disinhibition, can produce altered states of consciousness. This is the standard neurological explanation. It is plausible, it might be correct, but it does not explain why the hallucinations are overwhelmingly positive, peaceful, and structured rather than chaotic and frightening as oxygen deprivation typically produces. And it does not explain the cases where patients reported seeing deceased persons whose deaths they had not been informed of. I want to be scrupulously honest about the limitations of all this evidence. The past life cases are observational, not experimental. They cannot be reproduced on demand in a laboratory. The strongest cases are compelling, but the majority have methodological weaknesses. Cultural expectations clearly play a role in some cases, particularly in societies where reincarnation is a mainstream belief. The investigators, despite their considerable rigor, were not conducting double-blind controlled experiments. The NDE research is limited by the fundamental difficulty of establishing precise timing of experiences during cardiac arrest. The residual brain activity hypothesis has not been definitively ruled out. The veridical perception cases are anecdotal and rare. The AWARE study's image targets produced inconclusive results. Terminal lucidity is poorly understood and dramatically under-researched relative to its potential significance. The sample sizes are small. The mechanisms are completely unknown. A purely neurological explanation involving some unknown temporary compensation mechanism cannot be excluded. No single piece of evidence proves that consciousness survives death. No combination of evidence proves it. The materialist position that consciousness is produced by the brain and ends when the brain dies remains logically defensible. It has not been disproven, but the evidence has shifted the burden. It is no longer sufficient for the materialist to simply assert that consciousness equals brain activity and leave it at that. The materialist must now explain the specific anomalies. How does a 3-year-old in Louisiana know the name of a World War II escort carrier and a specific pilot who died in 1945? How does a patient with a flat EEG accurately describe specific actions taken by the medical team during cardiac arrest? How does a patient whose cortex has been physically destroyed by decades of Alzheimer's plaques recover full consciousness and clear memory minutes before death? How does a dying patient describe seeing a relative whose death they were never informed of? These are not philosophical questions. They are empirical questions. They have answers. We do not yet know what those answers are, but the fact that the standard materialist framework struggles to provide them is itself a significant data point. It tells us our understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the brain is incomplete, that the model is too simple, that something is missing from the picture. What is missing might be purely neurological, a more sophisticated understanding of brain function that we have not yet achieved. Future neuroscience might explain everything. That is possible, and I acknowledge it honestly. But what is missing might also be something more fundamental, something about the nature of consciousness itself that the materialist framework cannot describe because the framework was not designed to describe it. Something that requires a different kind of physics. Not the physics of energy and thermodynamics, the physics of information, quantum information. The physics that describes not just the matter but the pattern, not just the radio but the signal, not just the flame but the light. That is part 3, the quantum mechanics of consciousness, unitarity and the conservation of quantum information, the Penrose-Hameroff-Orch-OR model of quantum processes in neural microtubules, integrated information theory and the mathematical structure of consciousness, quantum biology and the discovery that quantum coherence operates in biological systems at body temperature, quantum entanglement and the possibility that consciousness is non-local, and the question that ties everything together. If consciousness is quantum information is the information that makes you. You conserve through the death of the brain by the most fundamental law of the most successful theory in physics. The physics will not prove reincarnation. Nothing in this series will prove reincarnation. But the physics will show you that the question of whether consciousness can survive death is not a religious question that science has settled. It is a scientific question that science has barely begun to ask, and the preliminary answers are more interesting than anyone expected. The most successful theory in the history of science is quantum mechanics. No other theory has been tested more precisely. No other theory has been confirmed more rigorously. The predictions of quantum electrodynamics match experimental measurements to 12 decimal places. That is like predicting the distance from New York to Los Angeles to within the width of a human hair. Quantum mechanics is the foundation of every piece of modern technology. Your phone, your computer, your MRI scanner, your GPS, your LED lights, every laser, every semiconductor, every transistor, every solar cell, every nuclear reactor operates on principles that quantum mechanics predicted and experiment confirmed. If quantum mechanics were wrong, none of these technologies would work. They work. Quantum mechanics is not wrong. And quantum mechanics says something extraordinary about information, something that most people have never heard, something that changes the entire conversation about consciousness and death and the possibility of survival. Quantum mechanics says information cannot be destroyed. This is not a metaphor. This is not philosophy. This is a mathematical theorem derived from the fundamental structure of quantum mechanics itself. The technical term is unitarity. The Schrödinger equation, the master equation of quantum mechanics that describes how quantum systems evolve over time, is unitary. This means the evolution preserves information. Every quantum state at any given time contains enough information to reconstruct every quantum state at every other time, both past and future. Information is never lost. Information is never created from nothing. Information is never destroyed into nothing. It transforms. It scrambles. It spreads. It delocalizes across the environment, but it is conserved. Always. Under every physical transformation, without exception. Let me make this concrete. Imagine you burn a book. The book is destroyed. The pages are ash. The words are gone. From a classical physics perspective, the information in the book is destroyed. You cannot reconstruct the text from the ash. But from a quantum mechanical perspective, the information is not destroyed. It is scrambled. The quantum states of every atom in the book are transformed by the combustion, but the total quantum information is conserved. In principle, with a sufficiently powerful quantum computer and complete knowledge of the quantum state of every particle of smoke and ash and heat radiation, you could reconstruct the book. Every word, every letter, every page. The information was not destroyed by the fire. It was dispersed into the environment, in a form too complex for any practical measurement to recover, but it exists. It is there. Quantum mechanics guarantees it. This is not a fringe interpretation. This is not a speculative hypothesis from the margins of physics. This is the mainstream consensus position in quantum physics, supported by virtually every major physicist working in quantum information theory, quantum gravity, and quantum foundations. The unitarity of quantum mechanics was at the center of one of the most famous and most consequential debates in modern physics. A debate that lasted 30 years, involved the greatest minds of the last half-century, and ended with a result that has profound implications for the question of consciousness and death: the black hole information paradox. In 1975, Stephen Hawking made a remarkable calculation showing that black holes are not perfectly black. They emit radiation, now called Hawking radiation, through a quantum mechanical process at the event horizon. Over enormous timescales, a black hole loses mass through this radiation and eventually evaporates completely, disappears, gone. The black hole that once swallowed stars and planets and light itself vanishes into a faint spray of thermal radiation. But what happened to the information? Every star, every planet, every photon that fell into the black hole carried quantum information. The specific quantum state of every particle. If the black hole evaporates and the Hawking radiation is purely thermal, carrying no information about what fell in, then the information has been destroyed. Unitarity has been violated. The most fundamental mathematical structure of quantum mechanics has been broken. Hawking initially argued exactly this. Information is destroyed in black holes. Quantum mechanics must be modified. Unitarity is not absolute. This was a bombshell. Because if unitarity fails in black holes, it might fail everywhere. And if unitarity fails anywhere, the entire mathematical structure of quantum mechanics is compromised. Almost every other physicist in the world disagreed with Hawking. Leonard Susskind at Stanford, Gerard Hooft at Utrecht, Nobel laureate, John Preskill at Caltech, Juan Maldacena at the Institute for Advanced Study. They all argued that information must be conserved, that the Hawking radiation must somehow encode the information about everything that fell into the black hole. That unitarity cannot be violated, because violating it would collapse the mathematical foundations of all of quantum physics. The debate raged for 30 years. Susskind wrote an entire book about it, called The Black Hole War. The resolution came through multiple theoretical developments. Maldacena's ads, CFT correspondence in 1997, showed that a gravitational theory in a volume of space is mathematically equivalent to a quantum theory on the boundary of that space. The holographic principle emerged. Information is not lost in the interior, it is encoded on the boundary. Hooft's work reinforced this conclusion from a different angle. The mathematics converged. Information is conserved. In 2004, Hawking publicly conceded he was wrong. Information is not destroyed in black holes. Unitarity holds. He paid off a famous bet with John Preskill, conceding with a baseball encyclopedia symbolizing the preservation of information. The greatest physicist since Einstein admitted that information cannot be destroyed. Even in the most extreme physical environment conceivable, even inside a black hole where space-time itself is torn apart, the information survives, scrambled beyond any practical recovery, but conserved, mathematically guaranteed. This result is not contested in modern physics. Information conservation is as fundamental as energy conservation, more fundamental in some formulations, because energy conservation can be derived from time translation symmetry through Noether's theorem, while unitarity is built into the deepest mathematical structure of quantum mechanics itself. It is not a consequence of a symmetry, it is a property of the theory's fundamental architecture. Now, apply this to consciousness. If consciousness is information, If the specific pattern of memories, personality, subjective experience, and self-awareness that constitutes you is fundamentally an informational structure encoded in the quantum states of your brain, then Unitarity says this information cannot be destroyed, not by brain death, not by the cessation of neural activity, not by the decomposition of your body. The information is conserved through every physical transformation by the most fundamental law of the most successful theory in physics. This is not the thermodynamic argument. The thermodynamic argument says energy is conserved, but the energy of your body is thermal and chemical energy that dissipates into heat when you die. The quantum information argument says something different. It says the pattern is conserved, not the energy. The pattern, the specific arrangement of quantum states that encodes your consciousness. That pattern cannot be destroyed. It can be transformed. It can be scrambled. It can be delocalized across the environment in a form so complex that no practical measurement could recover it. But it exists. Quantum mechanics guarantees it. The critical question is whether consciousness is quantum information, whether the thing that makes you you is encoded at the quantum level, whether the subjective experience of being a conscious person is fundamentally a quantum phenomenon. If it is, then unitarity applies. If it is not, then unitarity is irrelevant to consciousness, and the argument fails. This is where the Penrose-Hameroff-Orchard model enters. Roger Penrose is one of the most accomplished mathematical physicists alive. Nobel Prize in Physics 2020 for his work on black holes. Penrose Medal, Wolf Prize. Fellow of the Royal Society since 1972. He is not a fringe thinker. He is not a mystic. He is a mathematician of the highest caliber. And for over 30 years he has argued that consciousness is fundamentally a quantum gravitational phenomenon that cannot be explained by classical computation. Penrose's argument begins with Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Kurt Gödel proved in 1931 that any consistent formal system, powerful enough to express arithmetic, contains true statements that cannot be proven within the system. Penrose argues that human mathematical understanding transcends formal computation, that mathematicians can see truths that no algorithm can derive, that consciousness involves something that is not computable in the Turing sense. This is a controversial claim. Many computer scientists and philosophers disagree, but Penrose's mathematical credentials are beyond question, and his argument is rigorous even if its conclusions are debated. If consciousness is not computable, then it cannot be explained by the classical operation of neurons, which are computational devices. Consciousness requires something beyond classical physics. Penrose identified quantum gravity as the source. Specifically, he proposed that consciousness arises from objective reduction, OR, of the quantum state, not the collapse caused by measurement in standard quantum mechanics, a different kind of collapse caused by the instability of quantum superpositions involving different space-time geometries. When the mass-energy difference between two superposed states reaches the Planck scale, the superposition becomes unstable and collapses. This collapse, according to Penrose, is not random. It is influenced by the mathematical structure of space-time geometry. It is orchestrated, and it produces a moment of conscious experience. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, provided the biological component. Hameroff identified microtubules as the physical substrate for quantum consciousness. Microtubules are protein structures inside every neuron. They are hollow tubes, approximately 25 nanometers in diameter, made of tubulin protein subunits. Each tubulin can exist in two conformational states like a quantum bit. Hameroff proposed that tubulin subunits within microtubules can maintain quantum superposition, that quantum coherence can propagate along the microtubule, that the orchestrated objective reduction of these quantum states produces moments of conscious experience. Each OR event is a moment of consciousness. The sequence of OR events is the stream of consciousness. The OR model makes several specific claims: that quantum effects occur in biological neural tissue, that microtubules can sustain quantum coherence at body temperature, that consciousness is a quantum gravitational phenomenon, and critically that the quantum information processed in microtubules is not confined to the brain because quantum information is non-local, because entanglement connects quantum systems across space, because unitarity preserves quantum information through every transformation, including the death of the biological system. The model has been controversial since its proposal in the 1990s. The primary objection has been that the brain is too warm, too wet, and too noisy for quantum coherence to survive. Quantum effects in laboratory settings typically require temperatures near absolute zero and extreme isolation from environmental noise. The brain at 37 degrees Celsius, surrounded by thermal vibrations and chemical noise, seems like the worst possible environment for quantum coherence. But this objection has been significantly weakened and arguably demolished by discoveries in quantum biology over the last 2 decades. A new field that has shown conclusively that quantum effects operate in warm, wet, noisy biological systems at physiological temperatures. The critics said it was impossible. Biology said otherwise. In 2007, Graham Fleming and colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, published a groundbreaking study in Nature that sent shockwaves through both physics and biology. Using ultrafast laser spectroscopy, they demonstrated quantum coherence in the Fenner-Matthews-Olson FMO photosynthetic complex in green sulfur bacteria. The FMO complex is a molecular antenna that captures photons and transfers the excitation energy to the reaction center where photosynthesis occurs. Classical physics predicts that this energy transfer should be a random walk. The excitation hops from molecule to molecule randomly, eventually finding the reaction center by chance. The efficiency should be low. Significant energy should be lost as heat at each hop. Instead, Fleming's team showed that the excitation energy exists in quantum superposition, exploring multiple transfer pathways simultaneously. The energy does not hop randomly. It flows coherently through quantum interference, finding the optimal path with near-perfect efficiency approaching 100%. This quantum coherence persists at biological temperatures around 300 Kelvin for hundreds of femtoseconds, short by human standards but long enough to complete the energy transfer process, long enough to matter, long enough to change the outcome. Quantum mechanics operating in a warm, wet, noisy biological system. Exactly what the skeptics said could not happen. The discovery was replicated and extended by multiple groups. Gregory Scholes at the University of Toronto demonstrated similar quantum effects in marine algae. Alexandra Olaya Castro at University College London showed quantum entanglement between chromophores in photosynthetic complexes. The quantum biology revolution had begun, and photosynthesis was only the beginning. Quantum tunneling has been demonstrated in enzyme catalysis by Judith Klinman at UC Berkeley and Nigel Scrutton at the University of Manchester. Enzymes accelerate chemical reactions by factors of millions, and the tunneling of hydrogen atoms through energy barriers that classical mechanics says are impassable accounts for a significant portion of this catalytic power. Your body runs on quantum tunneling. Every metabolic reaction in every cell is accelerated by quantum mechanical effects. The radical pair mechanism in cryptochrome proteins provides perhaps the most dramatic example. European robins and other migratory birds navigate using the Earth's magnetic field. How? Klaus Scholten at the University of Illinois proposed in the 1970s that the mechanism was quantum mechanical. Photons hitting cryptochrome proteins in the bird's retina create radical pairs. Pairs of molecules, each with an unpaired electron. The two unpaired electrons are entangled. Their quantum spin states are correlated. The Earth's magnetic field subtly shifts the spin dynamics, changing the ratio of singlet to triplet states. This ratio changes the chemistry. The chemistry changes the neural signal. The bird knows which way is north, through quantum entanglement, in its brain, at body temperature. Peter Hoare at Oxford and Henrik Moritzen at Oldenburg have confirmed this mechanism experimentally. The bird's quantum compass works. It requires quantum coherence, lasting microseconds at biological temperatures, in a brain. This means that at least one organism on Earth already uses quantum coherence in neural tissue to process information about the external world. The question of whether quantum coherence can operate in biological neural tissue is not theoretical. It is settled. It does. The robin proves it. In 2014, Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan published evidence of quantum vibrations in microtubules. Using sophisticated nanotechnology probes, he detected coherent oscillations in tubulin proteins at megahertz and gigahertz frequencies that matched predictions of the Ochoa model. He showed that microtubules can sustain resonant oscillations at multiple frequency scales simultaneously. This does not prove Ochoa is correct in its entirety, but it demonstrates that the specific biological substrate Hameroff identified does exhibit quantum behavior. The microtubules are not purely classical objects. They have quantum properties at body temperature. In biological tissue, the foundation of the Ochoa model exists in physical reality. Let me be honest about the current status of Ochoa. It is a minority position in neuroscience. Most neuroscientists believe consciousness will ultimately be explained by classical neural computation. The quantum coherence times observed in microtubules are extremely short. The connection between quantum gravity and conscious experience is speculative. The model has not been confirmed by decisive experiment. These are legitimate criticisms. But Ochoa is not the only framework that connects consciousness to quantum mechanics. And even if Ochoa is wrong in its specific mechanism, the deeper question remains. Is consciousness fundamentally quantum mechanical? And if it is, does unitarity apply to it? Integrated Information Theory (IIT), developed by Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin, approaches consciousness from a completely different direction. IIT starts not with physics but with phenomenology. What are the essential properties of conscious experience? Tononi identifies 5 axioms. Existence, consciousness, exists. Composition, consciousness is structured. Information, each experience is specific and different from other possible experiences. Integration, consciousness is unified, it cannot be decomposed into independent parts. Exclusion, each experience is definite with specific borders. From these axioms, Tononi derives a mathematical quantity called phi that measures integrated information. Any system that has phi greater than 0 has some degree of consciousness according to IIT. The more integrated information, the more consciousness. A thermostat has a tiny amount of phi, a worm has more. A human brain has enormously more. Consciousness is not binary on or off, it is a continuum, a spectrum, and it is fundamental to the mathematics of information integration. IIT leads naturally to panpsychism, the philosophical position that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, not an emergent property of complex computation, that every physical system with integrated information has some degree of experience, that consciousness does not appear at some threshold of complexity but exists at every level in varying degrees. The electron has a vanishingly small amount of experience. The atom has slightly more, the molecule more, the neuron more, the brain enormously more. But the difference is quantitative, not qualitative. Consciousness is woven into the fabric of reality from the bottom up. If panpsychism is correct, then consciousness is not something the brain produces from unconscious matter. Consciousness is something the brain organizes, focuses, integrates, amplifies. The brain takes the distributed micro-consciousness present in every physical interaction at every scale, and integrates it into the unified macro-consciousness that you experience as being you. The brain is not a consciousness factory. The brain is a consciousness antenna, a consciousness lens, a consciousness orchestrator. When the brain dies, the integration stops. The unified consciousness that was you dissolves. The specific pattern of integrated information that constituted your personality, your memories, your identity, your sense of self, loses its organizational structure. But the underlying micro-consciousness that was being integrated does not disappear, because it was never produced by the brain. It existed before the brain organized it. It exists after the brain stops organizing it. The elements persist. The organization changes. The ocean does not disappear when the wave breaks. The wave was a pattern in the ocean. The pattern dissolves. The ocean remains. Philip Goff at Durham University has become one of the leading philosophical defenders of panpsychism. His argument is straightforward. We have two options for explaining consciousness. Either consciousness emerges from completely unconscious matter at some threshold of complexity, or consciousness is present at every level of physical reality in varying degrees of integration. The emergence option faces the hard problem. How does subjective experience arise from objective physical processes? No one has explained this. No one has even proposed a plausible mechanism. The panpsychist option dissolves the hard problem by denying that consciousness ever emerges. It was always there. The hard problem asks how consciousness comes from non-consciousness. Panpsychism answers it does not come from non-consciousness. It is always already present. The question changes from how does consciousness emerge to how does consciousness integrate? And integration is a much more tractable scientific problem than emergence from nothing. This connects directly to the Buddhist framework of anatta and rebirth. No permanent self, no fixed essence that transmigrates, but a process that continues. A stream of consciousness that flows through different organizational structures. The candle flame passed from wick to wick. No thing moves, but the process continues. The pattern propagates. The information reorganizes. In the language of IIT, the phi changes its distribution. The integrated information that was organized in the structure of one brain delocalizes and might reintegrate in another organizational structure. The specific you dissolves, but consciousness itself, the fundamental consciousness that was being integrated into the form called you, does not cease to exist. It cannot cease to exist. Because it was never produced, it was always there. It was being organized. And when one organization ends, the elements return to the field from which they were drawn, available for new organization, new integration, new patterns. This also connects to the Hindu framework, but with an important difference. The Hindu tradition says the Atman is unchanging and eternal. The same self passes through different bodies. IIT and panpsychism suggest something more subtle, not the same self, but the same consciousness. In a different organization, the self changes because the self is the organization, not the consciousness being organized. You are not consciousness. You are a specific pattern of consciousness, a specific integration. The pattern changes, the consciousness continues. This is closer to the Buddhist position than the Hindu one. But both traditions capture something that the physics also describes. Continuation without identity, persistence without permanence, process without substance. Now, quantum entanglement and its implications for consciousness and survival. This is the most directly relevant quantum phenomenon for the question of whether consciousness can persist beyond the death of a single brain. When two particles become entangled, their quantum states become correlated in a way that cannot be explained by any local hidden variable mechanism. This is not a theoretical possibility. It is an experimental fact, confirmed by Bell test experiments, conducted across 5 decades by dozens of independent research groups around the world. Measuring the spin of one entangled electron instantaneously determines the spin of its partner regardless of the distance separating them. The correlation is perfect. The effect is instantaneous. It does not diminish with distance. An entangled pair separated by a millimeter shows the same correlation strength as a pair separated by 1,000 kilometers. Alain Aspect confirmed it in Paris in 1982 with acousto-optic switches that changed the measurement settings faster than light could travel between the detectors. Nicolas Gizin extended it across the city of Geneva in the 1990s. Jianwei Pan used the Chinese Meisha satellite in 2017 to confirm entanglement across distances exceeding 1,200 kilometers. The Nobel Prize in Physics 2022 was awarded to Aspect Clauser and Zeilinger for their experimental work, establishing that entanglement is real, that Bell inequalities are violated, and that the universe is non-local. This is settled physics. If consciousness involves quantum processes in the brain, and the cumulative evidence from Ochoa, from quantum biology, from IIT, and from the philosophical arguments for panpsychism all converge on this possibility, then conscious states could become entangled with quantum states outside the brain. The quantum information encoding consciousness could become correlated with quantum systems in the broader environment through the same physical mechanism that entangles photons in laboratory experiments. At the moment of death, the quantum information in the brain does not disappear. It cannot disappear. Unitarity forbids it with the force of mathematical law. The information delocalizes, spreads into the environment through decoherence, becomes entangled with the surrounding quantum field. The pattern that was you disperses, not into nothing, into the quantum structure of the environment. The information is conserved, distributed, scrambled beyond practical recovery, but present, existing, guaranteed by the most fundamental property of the most successful theory in physics. And here is where the traditions become relevant again, not as proof, as structural parallels. The Hindu Sukshma, Sharira, the subtle body that carries karmic impressions from life to life, is structurally similar to quantum information that delocalizes from the brain at death, carrying the pattern of experience. The Buddhist consciousness stream that continues without a substance is structurally similar to quantum information that propagates through entanglement without any material carrier. The Jain karma particles that accumulate around the jiva are structurally similar to decoherence, the quantum information that becomes entangled with the environment through interactions. The question is whether the delocalized quantum information can relocalize, whether the pattern can reorganize, whether the consciousness that dispersed from one brain can influence or become integrated into another biological system. This is the quantum mechanical version of the reincarnation question. And quantum mechanics does not say it is impossible. Quantum information can be transferred through entanglement. Quantum teleportation has been demonstrated experimentally. The quantum state of one system can be transferred to another system through entanglement-mediated protocols. The fidelity of transfer depends on the entanglement. The distance is irrelevant. I am not saying that reincarnation has been explained by quantum mechanics. I am saying that quantum mechanics provides a framework in which the transfer of informational patterns from one physical system to another is not only possible, but is a demonstrated experimental reality. Quantum teleportation works. It has been confirmed by dozens of experiments across the world. The specific application to consciousness is speculative, but the underlying physics is confirmed. The honest summary is this: quantum mechanics provides three things that thermodynamics could not. First, a conservation law that applies to information, not just energy. Unitarity says the pattern that constitutes consciousness cannot be destroyed. Second, a mechanism for non-local transfer. Entanglement allows quantum information to be correlated across arbitrary distances. Third, a framework in which consciousness might be fundamental rather than emergent. Panpsychism and IIT suggest that consciousness is woven into the mathematical structure of information integration and does not require a brain to exist, only a brain to be organized into the specific form you experience as yourself. None of this proves reincarnation. None of this proves the soul survives death. None of this proves that consciousness transfers from one body to another. The gap between quantum information conservation and the specific claims of the Hindu or Buddhist or Jain traditions is enormous. Quantum teleportation transfers the state of a single particle, not the integrated information of 86 billion neurons. Unitarity conserves information in principle, but the delocalized, scrambled information is practically irrecoverable. Panpsychism is a philosophical position, not a confirmed scientific theory. But the framework is there. The physics allows it. And allowing is not nothing. Because the materialist claim was not that reincarnation is unlikely. The materialist claim was that it is impossible. That consciousness is produced by the brain, and when the brain dies, consciousness is extinguished. Period. Full stop. No physics allows otherwise. That claim is false. The physics does allow otherwise. Unitarity allows the conservation of consciousness information. Entanglement allows non-local transfer. Quantum biology confirms quantum effects in biological systems at body temperature. AuchoR provides a specific model, even if unconfirmed, of quantum processes in neural microtubules. IIT provides a mathematical framework in which consciousness is fundamental and organizational, rather than produced and destructible. The door that materialism claimed was permanently closed is open. Not wide open, not proven open, but open. The lock has been picked by the mathematics of quantum mechanics itself, and what might be on the other side of that door is the deepest question science has ever confronted. So, what do we actually know? Not what we hope, not what we fear, not what we want to be true because it comforts us, not what we want to be false because admitting otherwise would require restructuring our entire understanding of reality. What do we actually know, right now, based on the evidence and the physics and the philosophy? What can be stated with honesty? Here is what we know. We know that consciousness exists. This is the one thing that cannot be doubted. Descartes was right about this much. You might be wrong about everything else. The external world might be a simulation. Your memories might be false. Your senses might be deceiving you. But the fact that you are experiencing something right now, the fact that there is something it is like to be you reading these words, that fact is undeniable. Consciousness is the most certain thing in the universe. More certain than the existence of atoms. More certain than the laws of physics. More certain than mathematics. Because you could be wrong about atoms and physics and mathematics, you cannot be wrong about the fact that you are conscious right now. Consciousness is not a hypothesis. It is the ground on which all hypotheses stand. We know that neuroscience cannot explain consciousness. This is not a statement about the future of neuroscience. This is a statement about the present. After 150 years of modern neuroscience, after functional MRI and EEG and PET scans, and optogenetics and single neuron recording, and the complete connectome of C, elegans, and the partial connectome of the mouse brain, we have an extraordinarily detailed map of neural correlates. We know which brain regions are active during which experiences. We know that damage to the fusiform face area impairs face recognition. We know that damage to the hippocampus impairs memory formation. We know that damage to Broca's area impairs speech production. We know the correlates. We do not know the mechanism. We do not know how electrochemical activity in neurons produces subjective experience. We do not know why 86 billion neurons firing in specific patterns generates the inner light of awareness, rather than just processing information in the dark the way a computer does. David Chalmers called this the hard problem in 1995. 30 years later it remains hard, not because neuroscientists have not tried, because the problem might be structurally different from other scientific problems. It might require not more data but a different framework. We know that quantum mechanics conserves information. Unitarity is a mathematical theorem, not a conjecture. The Schrödinger equation preserves quantum information through every physical transformation without exception. This was confirmed at the highest level of theoretical physics through the black hole information paradox. Hawking conceded, information cannot be destroyed. If consciousness is encoded in quantum information, then the information that constitutes consciousness cannot be destroyed by the death of the brain. The pattern persists, transformed, scrambled, delocalized, but conserved. We know that quantum effects operate in biological systems at body temperature. Photosynthesis uses quantum coherence. Enzyme catalysis uses quantum tunneling. Migratory birds navigate using quantum entanglement in cryptochrome proteins in their retinas. The claim that biological systems are too warm and too noisy for quantum mechanics was falsified by experiment. Quantum biology is a confirmed field of science. We know that 2,500 cases of children reporting past life memories have been investigated by credentialed researchers at a major university over 6 decades. That in the strongest cases, children provided specific, verifiable details about deceased persons they had no normal way of knowing about. That in 225 cases, birthmarks on the children corresponded to documented wounds on the deceased persons. That the research was published in peer-reviewed journals and has not been debunked despite extensive scrutiny. We know that approximately 18% of cardiac arrest survivors in prospective studies report conscious experiences during periods of clinical death when the EEG is flat and the brain has no measurable electrical activity. That these experiences have consistent structural features across cultures and across belief systems. That some patients accurately described events in the resuscitation room during periods when their brains were not functioning. We know that terminal lucidity occurs, that patients with physically destroyed brains, ravaged by decades of Alzheimer's disease, recover full consciousness and clear memory in the hours before death. That this phenomenon directly contradicts the prediction of the production model that brain damage always reduces consciousness. These are the things we know, confirmed, documented, published, peer-reviewed, not contested by serious scientists, even when the implications are contested. Now here is what we do not know, and this list is longer and more important. We do not know whether consciousness is quantum information. The Orchor model proposes this, but it has not been confirmed by decisive experiment. The quantum vibrations detected in microtubules by Bandyopadhyay are suggestive but do not prove that consciousness arises from quantum processes in those structures. The quantum coherence demonstrated in photosynthesis and bird navigation proves that quantum effects operate in biological systems, but does not prove that the specific quantum effects relevant to consciousness operate in neurons. The leap from quantum biology to quantum consciousness is a leap, an informed leap, a reasonable leap, but a leap nonetheless. Consciousness might be entirely classical, a product of neural computation at scales far above the quantum level. The emergent complexity of 86 billion neurons connected by 100 trillion synapses might be sufficient to produce consciousness without any quantum contribution. If consciousness is classical, then unitarity is irrelevant to the survival question. The conservation of quantum information would not apply because consciousness would not be quantum information. This is a genuine possibility that intellectual honesty requires me to state with full force. We do not know whether the delocalized quantum information that disperses from the brain at death retains any coherent structure that could be called consciousness. Unitarity guarantees that the information is conserved, but conservation does not mean coherence. It does not mean accessibility. It does not mean identity. Consider the analogy more carefully. The information in a burned book is conserved by unitarity. Every quantum state of every atom transformed by the combustion continues to exist in the smoke and ash and thermal radiation. But the information is scrambled so thoroughly dispersed across so many particles correlated in such astronomically complex ways that no conceivable technology could reconstruct the text. The information is there. The book is gone. The same might be true of consciousness information at death, conserved in principle, lost in practice, existing as meaningless correlations in the thermal noise of the environment. The information equivalent of heat, technically present, functionally gone. Unitarity guarantees survival of information. It does not guarantee survival of meaning, and consciousness without coherence, without structure, without organization might be information without meaning, which is not consciousness at all. We do not know whether the past life cases documented by Stevenson and Tucker represent genuine memory transfer from a deceased person to a living child, or some other phenomenon that we do not yet understand. Cryptomnesia, the unconscious absorption of information through forgotten exposure, remains a plausible explanation for some cases. Fraud, either deliberate or unconscious on the part of families seeking social status or financial benefit, cannot be entirely ruled out in all cases. Cultural conditioning in societies where reincarnation is expected and rewarded might prime children to produce narratives that match the expected pattern. Statistical coincidence in a sample of 2,500 cases across decades and cultures might produce a small number of striking matches through chance alone. Each individual case, even the strongest ones, has alternative explanations. The cumulative weight of 2,500 cases is impressive, but cumulative weight is not proof. It is suggestive. It is anomalous. It demands explanation. But 2,500 anomalies do not prove a specific mechanism. They prove that something anomalous is happening. What that something is remains genuinely unknown. We do not know whether near-death experiences are experiences of an actual reality beyond the physical brain, or extraordinarily vivid, internally generated experiences produced by a dying brain through neurochemical mechanisms we do not yet fully understand. The neurochemistry of the dying process is complex and poorly studied for obvious ethical reasons. Massive endorphin release could produce the sense of peace and euphoria. Cortical disinhibition, as inhibitory circuits fail, could produce vivid hallucinations. REM intrusion, as the brainstem loses normal regulation, could produce the dreamlike quality. Temporal lobe activity during oxygen deprivation could produce the life review and the sense of a tunnel. Carl Janssen has argued that ketamine, which blocks NMDA receptors, produces experiences remarkably similar to NDEs, suggesting that endogenous NMDA receptor blockade during anoxia might produce the entire experience. Rick Strassman has proposed that DMT released by the pineal gland during extreme stress could produce the structured visionary component. These are speculative, but they are plausible neurochemical explanations. The fact that we cannot currently provide a complete neurological account of NDEs does not mean such an account is impossible. It means we have not completed it yet. And not yet is a very different statement from never. We do not know whether terminal lucidity represents consciousness operating independently of brain hardware or some unknown neurological compensatory mechanism that temporarily restores function in the dying brain. Perhaps the massive release of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators that accompanies the dying process temporarily reactivates neural circuits that had been suppressed but not entirely destroyed by the disease. Perhaps the brain has reserves of functional capacity that are normally inhibited, and the disinhibition of dying briefly unleashes them. The phenomenon is dramatic and currently unexplained, but unexplained is not unexplainable. The history of science is filled with phenomena that seem to require supernatural explanation until the natural explanation was discovered. The aurora borealis was once the dance of spirits. Epilepsy was demonic possession. The diversity of life was divine creation. Each found a natural explanation. Terminal lucidity might find one too. The fact that it currently lacks a neurological explanation does not mean it will always lack one. It might, but it might not. And honesty requires acknowledging both possibilities. We do not know whether panpsychism is true. It is a philosophical position, not a confirmed scientific theory. Integrated information theory provides a mathematical framework, but the framework has not been validated experimentally in a way that distinguishes it from competing theories. The hard problem of consciousness might eventually be solved within a materialist framework through a theoretical breakthrough we cannot currently imagine. The history of science suggests this is possible. Many problems that seemed permanently insoluble were eventually solved by someone who asked the right question in the right way. This is the honest accounting. The evidence is far more interesting than materialists typically acknowledge. The uncertainties are far greater than believers typically admit. Both sides cherry-pick. Materialists dismiss the anomalies and declare the question settled. Believers inflate the anomalies and declare the case proven. Both are wrong. The question is not settled. The case is not proven. We are in the middle, in the uncertainty, in the gap between what the evidence suggests and what the evidence proves. And the honest response to being in the gap is not to pretend you are on solid ground on either side. The honest response is to stand in the gap and look clearly in both directions. Let me tell you what I think, not what I can prove, what I think. After years of reading the physics and the neuroscience and the case studies and the philosophy, after examining every argument I could find on every side, I think consciousness is more fundamental than the materialist framework allows. I think this because the hard problem is real and has not gotten easier with more neuroscience. Because terminal lucidity is real and directly contradicts the production model. Because quantum mechanics has revealed a universe in which information is conserved through every transformation and in which the observer cannot be removed from the description of physical reality. Because 4,000 years of contemplative investigation across every culture on Earth converges on the claim that consciousness is not produced by the body, but is channeled through it. Because the evidence from children's past life memories is too specific and too consistent to be explained entirely by fraud and coincidence. Because 18% of cardiac arrest survivors report structured conscious experiences during periods of flat EEG. I think something survives. Not necessarily the personality, not necessarily the memories, not necessarily the ego, the identity, the narrative self, the collection of preferences and habits and biographical facts that you call me. The traditions themselves disagree about what survives. The Hindu says the Atman survives unchanged. The Buddhist says nothing survives but the process continues. The Jain says the jiva survives but its accumulated karma changes. Islam says the nafs survives and awaits resurrection. The physics cannot currently resolve this disagreement, but I think the information, the pattern, the fundamental consciousness that was organized into the form of you is not extinguished by the death of the brain. I think it is conserved, transformed, possibly reorganized, possibly integrated into new structures, possibly dispersed into the quantum field that underlies all physical reality. I think the universe is not a machine that accidentally produces consciousness as a byproduct of sufficient neural complexity and discards it when the neural complexity breaks down. I think the universe is more like an ocean of consciousness that temporarily organizes itself into individual waves, and when those waves break, the water returns to the ocean. Whether the water reorganizes into a new wave that carries some imprint of the previous wave's pattern, and whether this constitutes reincarnation in the sense the traditions describe, I genuinely do not know. The physics allows it, the evidence suggests it, but the gap between allows and suggests and proves is enormous, and I stand in that gap, honestly. Whether what I have described constitutes reincarnation in the Hindu sense, where the same Atman inhabits a new body, or rebirth in the Buddhist sense, where a process continues without a substance that continues, or something entirely different that no tradition and no physics has yet articulated, I cannot say. The traditions offer maps, the physics offers constraints, neither offers a complete answer. And anyone who tells you they have the complete answer, whether they wear a lab coat or a religious vestment, is either deceived or deceiving. But I also think that certainty is premature, on either side. The confident materialist who declares that consciousness is neurons and death is the end, full stop, case closed, is ignoring the anomalies, ignoring the 2,500 cases, ignoring the 18% NDE rate, ignoring terminal lucidity, ignoring the hard problem, ignoring the implications of unitarity, ignoring the evidence because it does not fit the model rather than revising the model to fit the evidence. That is not science. That is ideology wearing a lab coat. And the confident believer who declares that reincarnation is proven by quantum physics is equally wrong, inflating the evidence, misunderstanding the physics, confusing structural parallels with causal explanations, confusing consistency with proof, confusing possibility with certainty, using quantum mechanics as a sophisticated decoration for conclusions that were reached on faith, not evidence. That is not spirituality. That is confirmation bias wearing a prayer shawl. The honest position is between them. Not in the comfortable middle of indifference where you shrug and say who knows and change the subject. In the uncomfortable middle of genuine uncertainty, active uncertainty. The kind that demands continued investigation. The kind that reads the papers and examines the evidence and sits with the discomfort of not knowing. The kind that keeps you awake at 3 a.m. not because you are afraid of death, but because you are fascinated by the question. Because the question is real. The evidence is real, the physics is real, and the answer matters more than almost any other answer available to a human being. Here is what I want you to take from this series. Not a belief, not an answer, not a team to join. A question. Your question. Not the question I have given you, but the question that has formed in your own mind as you have considered the evidence. The question that you cannot quite shake. The question that surfaces when you are quiet and honest with yourself about what you actually think rather than what you are supposed to think. For some of you, the question might be this: if consciousness is quantum information and quantum information is conserved through every physical transformation, including death, then what happens to my consciousness when I die? Where does the pattern go? Can it reorganize? Can it reintegrate? And if it can, what would that reorganization look like from the inside? Would there be continuity? Would there be memory? Would you know you had been someone else? Or would the reorganization be so complete that the new pattern would have no trace of the old? The Buddhist tradition says the latter. The flame is past, but the new flame does not remember being the old flame. The Hindu tradition says something different. The Atman remembers at a deep level even if the surface personality does not. Which description better matches the physics? The answer depends on whether the reorganized information retains coherent structure or whether it is scrambled beyond recognition. And we do not yet know. For some of you, the question might be empirical. If children can accurately describe the lives of deceased persons, they never met with specific names, dates, locations, and manners of death. And if those descriptions include birthmarks that correspond to documented wounds, then what is the mechanism? Not the spiritual explanation, the physical mechanism. What is the information channel? Through what medium does the information travel? By what process does it imprint on a developing embryo? Does quantum entanglement provide a mechanism for non-local information transfer between the quantum states of a dying brain and the quantum states of a developing fetus? Is this testable? Could we design an experiment? Could we measure the entanglement? The physics says entanglement is real. The cases say information transfer is real. The mechanism connecting the two is the missing piece. Finding it would be the most important scientific discovery in human history. Not finding it would tell us something important too. For some of you, the question might be more personal and more urgent. If consciousness survives death in some form, then does the way I live this life affect the form it takes next? Is karma real? Not as supernatural judgment, but as informational consequence? Do my actions leave impressions on the quantum information pattern that constitutes my consciousness? Is every act of cruelty a deformation of the pattern? Is every act of compassion a refinement? Am I right now in this moment shaping the information that will persist through my death? And if so, what am I shaping it into? The Hindu and Buddhist and Jain traditions all say yes. Every action leaves a trace. Every trace affects the trajectory. The physics neither confirms nor denies this. But if consciousness is information, and information is shaped by every interaction with the environment, then every action does change the information. Every experience modifies the pattern. Every choice leaves a mark on the quantum state that might be you at the deepest level. For some of you, the question might be the hardest one of all. What if none of this is true? What if consciousness is entirely classical, and unitarity is irrelevant, and the children's memories are all explained by cryptomnesia, and the NDEs are all neurochemical hallucinations, and terminal lucidity is a compensatory mechanism, and the hard problem will eventually be solved by neuroscience, and when you die you simply cease? What if there is nothing after the last heartbeat? What if the light goes out and there is only darkness, and the darkness is not even darkness because there is no one left to perceive it? What then? How do you live with that? And here is the remarkable thing. This question, the question of how to live in the face of possible annihilation, is itself one of the deepest questions a conscious being can ask. And the fact that you can ask it, the fact that the universe has produced a being capable of contemplating its own mortality and asking what it means, is itself evidence that the universe is stranger and deeper and more consciousness-friendly than the simple, materialist picture allows. A universe that produces beings who can ask whether they survive death is a universe that has already done something extraordinary, whether or not those beings actually survive. Every one of these questions is legitimate. Everyone deserves honest investigation, and everyone remains open. For you, for me, for the physicists and neuroscientists and contemplatives who are still working on the problem, for the next generation of researchers who will have tools and techniques we cannot currently imagine. The universe does not give easy answers to hard questions. It gives evidence, partial evidence, suggestive evidence, evidence that points in a direction without arriving at a destination. The direction is clear. The evidence points away from simple materialism, away from the confident claim that you are nothing but neurons, and when the neurons stop, you stop. Away from the 19th century clockwork universe, where consciousness is an epiphenomenon and death is annihilation, and the question of survival is not even worth asking. The evidence points toward a universe in which consciousness is more fundamental, more persistent, more conserved than the materialist worldview assumed. A universe in which information is never destroyed, in which quantum effects operate in biological neural tissue, in which the observer cannot be removed from the description of physical reality, in which the relationship between consciousness and the brain is more complex and more mysterious than the simple production model can account for. Whether the evidence points all the way to reincarnation, whether the pattern that is you can survive death and reorganize in a new biological system and continue the journey that the traditions describe. That question, honest, rigorous, open investigation, has not yet answered. It might answer it in the next decade. It might take a century. It might take longer. The question is hard, harder than any question in physics. Because it sits at the intersection of quantum mechanics and neuroscience and philosophy of mind and contemplative phenomenology and the most personal experience any human being will ever have. The investigation continues. In the quantum biology laboratories, where researchers probe the limits of coherence in warm biological tissue. In the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, where children's past life reports continue to be documented with meticulous care. In the neuroscience labs, where the hard problem of consciousness refuses to yield to reductive explanation. In the contemplative traditions, where practitioners continue the 4,000-year experiment of investigating consciousness from the inside, using the instrument of consciousness itself. In the physics departments, where the relationship between information and consciousness and quantum gravity and the foundation of reality is being explored at the deepest level any human mind has ever reached. And in you, in your own investigation, in your willingness to sit with the evidence and the uncertainty and the questions that do not have answers yet, in your courage to consider possibilities that make you uncomfortable, whether that discomfort comes from the possibility that there is something after death or from the possibility that there is not, in your honesty about what you know and what you do not know, in the 3 a.m. moments when you stare at the ceiling and wonder. The question is real, the evidence is real, the physics is real, your consciousness is real. And what happens to it when the pattern of your neurons falls silent for the last time is the deepest question you will ever ask. Deeper than any question in physics, deeper than any equation, deeper than any theorem, because it is not abstract, it is personal. It is about you, about the light behind your eyes, about where it came from, about where it goes. I do not have the answer, neither does anyone else, not the physicist, not the neuroscientist, not the guru, not the priest, not the philosopher, not yet. But the investigation is the most important thing our species is doing, all of us, together, across every discipline and every tradition and every century, asking the same question that the first human asked when they watched someone they loved take their last breath and wondered where they went, when they watched the fire go out and wondered where the light went. Where does the light go? We are still looking, and the looking itself might be the most human thing we do.